My name is Paul Oliver. I'm the owner of Pinellas Power Products. This is the installation instruction video for any of the generators using the Pride 459cc engine. For this particular video, I'm going to be using the Predator Model 9500 generator, but any of the generators using the Pride 459cc engine will be applied to this. The kit comes with a bag of small parts, which includes a USB flash drive with a copy of this video on it, hose clamps, hose barb, a set of written instructions that basically says you bought the greatest thing since sliced bread. There'll be a decal that you'll put on top of the generator with the operating instructions for how to run it off the remote tank and how to run it off the stock tank. The kits are going to come with a tube of Permatex Ultra Black silicone gasket sealer to reseal the valve cover gasket if you should happen to tear the valve cover gasket on installation or on removal of the valve cover. As soon as I find a reliable source for valve cover gaskets for this generator, I will start including valve cover gaskets instead of the gasket sealant. But for right now, because I can't find a reliable source for valve cover gaskets, they're going to get a tube of sealant. If your valve cover comes off and the gasket is in perfectly good shape, then you can reuse the gasket easily. If your gasket tears when you pull it off, either don't tear away any of it or completely remove the gasket and then put gasket sealant on both sides. So if it's got a tear somewhere, make sure that you put gasket sealant where the tear is and then on both sides, but don't remove one section of the gasket and then leave another section on there. That's guaranteed to make it leak. If you have removed any of the gasket, just remove it all. But like I say, as soon as I find a reliable source for replacement gaskets, these kits will come with a replacement valve cover gasket instead of the tube of sealant. You'll have a roll of Teflon tape for all the threaded fittings. You'll have a Pcv valve to replace the stock Pcv valve that's in it now. It'll come with a fuel pump, fuel filter, 2 inches of Velcro, which you'll see what that's for later on, a straight fuel fitting, a 90-degree fuel fitting, a Yamaha fuel hose with a prime bulb, and in a section of Gates Barricade 1/4 inch low perm fuel hose, and then a bunch of zip ties in there just to tidy up the work area. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. As I said earlier, this video we're going to be using the Predator 9500 generator. Let me cover some things real quickly here. All my kits include a fuel pump. I do not do the through the cap systems. The through the cap systems, number one, don't work. Number two, they're dangerous. If your generator is a gravity feed like this one, and you go through the cap and set the fuel tank up in the air, then what it does is it's just like taking a gas can and pouring gas into the generator. So if you've got a 12-gallon remote tank trying to fill a 5-gallon stock tank, it's not going to stop once it gets filled up. It's going to fill it up all the way to the fuel tank vent, then it's going to run through the fuel tank vent hose, fill up the evaporative emissions canister, and then go through the crankcase breather and fill up the crankcases or drip out on the ground. At any rate, it's not a safe solution. So that's why we do it with the fuel pump, because if the generator stalls for any reason, it stops transferring the fuel. Where a gravity feed system, gravity is always working. Okay, so the first step will be to remove the spark plug cap, and that's very simple. And if you'll notice real quickly, let me get a flashlight. This rubber seal down here doesn't fit real well, and that's just how it is. Don't get too excited when you go to put yours back together and you notice that this the way they molded it is not a real good fit. The next step will be to remove the stock breather hose. There's a clip that removes the fuel tank vent hose, and incidentally this hose here is the fuel tank vent hose. The one behind it is the fuel hose. This one goes to a standpipe that goes up about 1/4 of an inch from the top of it, and that's where the gasoline comes out of if you overfill the tank, or if you try one of those kits that has the gravity feed system instead of mine. At any rate, this is a Corbin clamp, and to undo that you simply squeeze the 2 tabs and slide it back. Slide the hose out, and then pull this in out of the ear box. If you look in the ear box, you'll see that there's a bolt that pushes in on the side of this hose, and the replacement hose that we're going to push in goes past that bolt too. So now we're going to remove the valve cover, and hopefully this valve cover gasket won't tear. If it does, that's what the gasket sealant is for. Okay, so this one came off nice and clean. So now we're going to disable the stock PCV valve, and you take the 5 Phillips head screws out. Okay, this thin wafer of metal right here is the PCV valve. I don't know if you can see that moving or not. Okay. What we're going to do is bend the PCV valve to where it stays open. You can either take a pair of needle nose pliers and bend it to where it stays open, or zip tie it in the open position with one of the zip ties included in the kit. For this particular video, we'll go ahead and use a zip tie, but at any rate, if you were going to bend it, you just push it open a little bit, then reach in here with a pair of needle nose pliers and bend it back and kink it. I'm just going to zip tie it open with one of the zip ties included with the kit. So that would be the zip tie method, as you can see, or the bend it method. I'll demonstrate that now. And what you'll have to do is get a hold of a little bit of the stop too, and bend the stop back so you got enough room to work. and now it's permanently open. So either method is perfectly acceptable. Then you put the 5 Phillips head screws back in place. This valve cover actually, or the valve cover gasket is actually in beautiful shape, so we won't be putting any gasket sealant on that. Okay. Then included in the kit was 2 inches of Velcro, the soft side and the stiff side. Take the stiff side of Velcro, and you'll see where the heat shield is on the fuel tank. Put it right next to the heat shield, right here. And this is going to be used to mount the fuel pump. Then take the soft side of Velcro, and put it on the back of the fuel pump. Ultimately, the fuel pump is going to go on with the 2 tabs almost straight up and down. I'm going to set this aside because once you stick it to that Velcro, it is a serious pain to get it apart again. The next step, make sure that the fuel selector valve is in the off position, otherwise you'll have fuel running out on the ground. If you look back in here, you'll see that there is a hose running from the fuel tank to the fuel selector valve, and then from the fuel selector valve running to the carburetor. So each one of these has Corbin clamps on it. What we're going to do is remove the Corbin clamp from this hose back here, and that goes from the fuel selector valve to the carburetor. And what you do is you squeeze onto 2 little tabs and just wiggle the hose back. And then I'll slide the hose off of that port. So there's your Corbin clamp right here. You'll notice that there is a protective O-ring that goes in this groove. Can you see right where my index finger is? You see this tab on the air filter? Originally this was right here holding it in place. You're going to slide it out of that groove because now the fuel hose is going to run straight up. So that can run down and just lay next to the carburetor and you're fine. This is the hose that goes to the carburetor. So we're going to put it on the output port of the fuel pump. And you'll notice that, number one, it's the port that heads off in a different direction. And number two, it has a tiny little arrow on it. So what we're going to do is slide the output for the fuel pump onto this port. And then we'll put the Corbin clamp into place, and then we're going to go ahead and stick the fuel pump onto the Velcro, just like that. Just make sure that this hose is not pinched or kinked or anything like that, and it runs nice and smoothly. The next step, you'll take the section of hose that's included in the kit, we'll take I've got these already cut to length forming. The first section of hose you'll cut to 6.5 inches. You'll take the T-fitting that comes in the kit, next section of hose, cut to 12.5 inches. Put that on. And then the balance of the hose, you're going to trim to fit later on. Put that onto the opposite side of the T-fitting. So then you'll have a hose shape that looks like this. Set that off to the side. Take the Pcv valve that's included in the kit, and now this is going to be assembled just like this. You'll slide the clear hose onto the valve cover, right where the original breather line came off of. Tuck this section underneath the fuel tank vent. Let me know if you're having trouble seeing, because I know everything's black in here and so forth. Then this hose is going to go into the bottom of the air filter, at the top of the air filter, right where I showed you earlier where that bolt makes it a little bit difficult. It goes in just like this. Then this end of the hose, you'll bend around, and you'll see there's a letter P on this port of the fuel pump, and that stands for pulse. And that's the one that lines up with the gold filter. And just make sure that this hose isn't kinked or anything like that or pinched shut. I'm going to take another clamp and put it on the valve cover itself. You'll have enough clamps that you can put them all through here. It's not critical to put them on the breather line, because keep in mind that the breather line carries air, not gasoline. When dealing with the gasoline hoses, we want hose clamps at every single junction. Now what we're going to do is go around the back side of the generator and pull the opposite side cover off. This side cover is held on by small black bolts, identical to the ones on the other side cover. So if you get them confused, it's not going to be any problem. I'm going to go ahead and pull this bottom panel off. Any other time it would have unsnapped, but this time it's not going to. Incidentally, it's also held on with two more of the identical black bolts. We're just going to pull the recoil rope down, let that hang down. Okay. Now if you come back over to this side, and this will be the hose that we made up just a few minutes earlier. We're going to take this section of hose and feed it through to where it's coming out the other end of the, or the other side of the generator. This section of hose, I'm going to run around the outside of the pulse line for the fuel pump, because I don't want it to interfere with the choke mechanism. So it's going to run around the outside, and that's going to go to the input line on the fuel pump. And if you notice, there's a tiny little arrow right here pointing in to the fuel pump. This hose is going to go to the fuel selector valve, where we removed this hose with the Corbin clamp from earlier. So this is going to go around in a loop. You see the hose now? I'm going to reach in there with a pair of needle nose pliers, and I'm going to put it onto okay. So now what we want to do is make sure that everything is nice and smooth. No sharp bends. Okay? Since this hose is carrying gasoline, we're going to put a clamp on the fuel pump. And then the hose that went from the T-fitting on this to the back side of the fuel selector valve is also going to get a clamp. Go ahead and shine that flashlight in here so I can see it a little better. Okay, I believe that it's actually easier to get at from the back side, probably easier to see right from where you're at. Okay. Then just run your hands in here and make sure that there's no sharp kinks on anything. I'm going to take one of the zip ties included in the kit and put it around all three of these hoses just to kind of keep them together. Don't squeeze it tight enough to crimp any of the hoses shut, especially the fuel tank vent hose, which is much softer than the rubber of the hoses that I use. And there are plenty of zip ties included in the kit. Okay, now that we've got the fuel lines all back into place, I'm going to turn the fuel selector knob, which also controls the choke, all the way to the choke position and then all the way back again, just to make sure that the choke is not being interfered with by anything. And the choke would be this little lever right here, if you want to turn the flashlight on to get a better view of that or not. So that would be the run position. That would be the choke or start position. And that would be back to run position. So this one moves freely. Okay, now we're going to put the fuel input port. Now, I like the fuel input port on these to be in a location that you don't snag your knee or something like that when you're walking by. So the best location on this is actually this recessed area right above the recoil start rope. So the fuel input port we're going to use on this one is going to be one of the straight style. Just like we used on the Predator 3500. So it's going to recess right in here. Okay, if you run a straight line from the bottom nut across the recoil rope to the top nut, we'll say that that would be the straight line where I've scribed it. And then this flat surface area, go to the middle of it, which lines up almost right on with these two webs. Now you'll notice that the threaded portion is not dead center. So instead of drilling the hole dead center, you'll go off center about 5 millimeters. And right here is where we'll drill the pilot hole. Ultimately, the hole has to be big enough for this to thread through. So I've switched the small drill bit for a unibit. Okay, that's getting real close to the finished size. So I'm going to use a repairman's reamer instead of the step drill. If you're feeling brave, you can use a step drill or whatever, but I want this to be just barely big enough, so I'm going to do it by hand, the rest of it. It's a little bit slow, but it keeps you from making mistakes. A little bit more to go. Perfect. I'm going to pull the recoil rope out quite a bit here and just clamp it off so I've got room to work. What I'm going to do is unbolt this panel now that we've got the hole drilled where it needs to be for the centering here. And you'll see why in just a minute here. Incidentally, you can put the hole for the fuel fitting below the recoil rope. However, I don't like doing that because the fuel hose comes over the top of the engine and it would have to go down further and then make a sharp bend. So I don't want to cause you any more grief. What you're going to do is take the fuel fitting and it's going to pass through the panel and then screw onto a hose barb on the back. But this panel is very thin. So because the panel is so thin, there's a 1/2-inch washer with a side cut off of it included in the kit. If you'll notice the side cut off, that's so that it will clear the screw head. Depending on where you drilled this hole at, there should be plenty of room for the screw head to go in there. As you can clearly see, there's plenty of room on this one. The first thing we're going to do is take the Teflon tape included in the kit, and we're going to wrap it around the threads of the fuel fitting. When you're doing this, be careful not to overlap the end of it because that'll shear off. And incidentally, you'll notice I've wrapped this in the wrong direction. In order to make sure that it doesn't unwind, wrap it this way around the threads. That's way whenever it's screwing on, it's not unwinding your Teflon tape. And give you about 2 or 3 layers of Teflon tape and then pull it off. You're going to pass the fuel fitting through the 1/2-inch washer and just set this all loosely on. And it'll look like this from the outside. The fuel fitting we're going to grab with a pair of locking pliers. And then we're going to screw the hose barb on from the back. And you don't have to honk down on this real tight. Just snug it down just a little bit. And that's so that you can realign this to make sure it passes the handle for the recoil start. So we'll take this and turn this. Ultimately, what we want it to do is slide into the recessed area like this. And the whole reason we're doing this extra bit of work is so that you don't have this sticking out from the side of the generator anywhere. Because you can cut your knee or your hand or whatever on that. So I'm going to snug this down just a little bit more. keep in mind this is a nylon fitting. Don't go too crazy on this when you're snugging it down. Okay. Here's how this will look from the outside. So now, if you look at it, instead of a fuel fitting sticking out like this from the side of the generator, you've got this one recessed in here, and it doesn't stick out even as far as the recoil handle. If you would prefer to have another one of these fittings instead of the straight one, because they're much easier to install, if you wanted to install it somewhere up here or along the side, it'll be sticking out, but that's your option. Just contact me before you order it, and we'll go over how to have this one switched out to the straight one. And that's not a problem at my end. So now we'll remove the clamp. Take the hose that's running from the other side we push through. The kit's going to come with a fuel filter. The fuel filter has an arrow on it pointing in the direction of fuel flow, which is this way. We're going to cut the fuel hose right up above the engine, and we're going to put the fuel filter in it, and then we will put a hose clamp on both sides, because again, this is carrying gasoline. So this side is going to come from the fuel fitting. And we'll go ahead and put this hose clamp on now, because it's a whole lot easier to do it now than it is with it above the engine. This panel will slide into these two little notches up here and then fold shut. Just make sure that this rubber boot goes right around this when you're putting the whole thing back together again. So what we're going to do, I'm just measuring to see how much room I've got. I'm going to cut my fuel hose off. I'll slide that onto this hose barb. And then we'll put another hose clamp here. Okay. Now let's come around this side and make sure that the fuel line is not pinched or kinked or anything. And you can actually slide your hand all the way through and feel the entire distance of this fuel hose. You want to shine the flashlight in there, you'll be able to see it. No kinks, no binds. So now we'll take the bottom panel, we'll put it on right here. As I said, it does make it difficult when you put the fuel fitting in here, but I like it recessed like that. If you'd prefer for me to exchange for one of these fittings, so it's much easier to install, and you'd want to put it up here or something like that, it's a lot easier for you to install, but it just doesn't look as clean. Then you've got the decal with the instructions for how to run the generator off the fuel kit. There's a clear place on top of the gas tank to install it. Okay. And now we'll go ahead and put this cover back on, and then we'll take it outside and we'll run it. I'd like to take that flashlight, just throw it in the trash. This is the Yamaha fuel hose that we've been using to start this thing up with. Let me just get my tools cleaned up here. When you're finished with the installation of the kit, you'll wind up with the breather hose not reused, because remember, we're using our own PCV valve that comes in the kit. And that should just about do it. We'll go ahead and roll it outside and test fire it.